Hi everyone, I'm Tao, and this is my presentation for the Visualizing Peace project. I'll be presenting my entries to the Visualizing Peace library. My topic for my research focus has been Sri Lanka, the civil war in Sri Lanka, and peace in Sri Lanka. My intentions behind these entries was to present a cross-section through disciplines and through history of the Civil War, of approaches to seeing the Civil War. And I thought it might be interesting to have a number of library entries on one particular case study or one particular geography of conflict, so that maybe it might allow for a more holistic approach. So the background, well, all of my entries are around Sri Lanka. So the background for the Sri Lankan Civil War, I'll just talk a bit about that. So the Civil War officially spans from 1983 to 2009. It was fought between the separatist group known as the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or the LTTE, who wanted a separate state for the Tamils, which are an ethnic minority group in Sri Lanka. And it was between them and the Sinhala, which was the ethnic majority group, the Sinhala-dominated government. The south of the island, which was Sinhala-dominated, was also simultaneously experiencing violence through an insurrectionist party known as the JVP, and their battles with the incumbent government. I have 5 texts I'm going to talk about today, and all of them center around 4 themes. So the first one is the roots of conflict. So the key to lasting peace is looking back and curing or treating the roots of the conflict rather than the symptoms. So I thought it might be interesting to look at what the roots of what people have been saying the roots of civil war are, and maybe that would open up comparisons between the civil war in Sri Lanka to other conflicts and other peace building in the world. The second theme is international peace building, specifically the limits of liberal peace building methods in Sri Lanka. The third is remembering the conflict, how conflict is remembered during peacetime. And this text I'll be talking about looks specifically at monuments, how they're built, who builds them, and the politics behind that. And finally, what present day peace looks like. So officially the war ended in 2009, but how much of that is true peace, and who is it peace for? The first text is titled The Generation of Communal Identities. So this looks at different understandings of the past and how these different understandings are molded by present ideologies and present politics. One big thing they talk about is how the communal identities of Tamil and Sinhala, which are taken for granted as stringent and as obvious by some present day historians, and the writers of this chapter emphasize that this has not always been the case, and that before pre-colonial times, before colonial times, such divisions weren't as clear cut. It was more along religious lines or language divides rather than ethnic lines. And then they also talk about the colonial impact. So what colonial policies, colonial understandings, their British ideologies, how they influenced or they strengthened or bolstered an understanding of what an ethnic community looks like and what the role that played in government. So there are ideas of racial theory and communal representation. First, they encouraged representation through communal, like through your community rather than your geography, for example, your territorial claims, and the franchise, which is the vote. They changed their policy later on, said one person gets one vote, and how this affected the current racial relations and how this might have strengthened the communal, I guess, the identity of a community. And then they also look at post-independence and how due to like economic migration and the current political parties, how they used violence as a political resource. So they look at Sri Lanka throughout history and see how what's now been used by a lot of people in current Sri Lankan society as two opposing and distinct groups that are meant that it was inevitable for them to get into conflict with each other. Look at our past, this is how it's happened. This chapter kind of questions that and says, well, not really. And I think it's very interesting example of looking back on history, looking back on history in a more neutral, in a way that isn't, in a way that doesn't have the present as something that's predestined, predetermined. The next text is by Serena Tenekun, titled Newspaper Nationalism, Single Identity as Historical Discourse. And in this book chapter, Serena Tenekun looks at how the past plays a role in influencing how the Civil War is interpreted. So she examines the impact of political events and cultural events and how this influenced contemporary discourse and nationalist identity and nationalist trends. And she does this by examining 3 newspaper debates in the newspaper Divayina. What I found particularly interesting about this piece is how contemporary, in this case, intelligentsia, look back on history and how they reinterpret certain events to match the context, the present context, and perhaps there may be their agendas. So she uses a phrase looking at the past as a paradigm, which I found interesting, and seeing the past as justification for the present. So a particular example she uses that has been used is the figure of King Dutugamanu, who was a pre-colonial figure, and he was a Sinhala Buddhist king who had defeated the Indian Tamil king Elara, and the current or the contemporary audiences in the newspaper debates had seen this before the start of the war, when there were a lot of Sinhalese riots against the Tamils. They had seen it as justification, as historical precedent for how Sinhalese had kicked out the Tamils, and they had glorified King Dutugamanu as kicking out the outsider, the other. But after the war had started, and after the LTTE had also started their violence and their claims for separate Elam, then the same example was used as King Dutugamunu, the Singhalan Buddhist king, reuniting the country under one flag. So they've decided to focus on separate aspects, or maybe enlarge separate aspects of this myth to suit the present. And I thought it was maybe worth paying attention to how something like history, myths and legends can play a role in have and how they've been manipulated to break peace down. So the third piece I'm going to talk about is about peace building, or international or liberal peace building. So this is part of a wider collection that looks at the failed consequences of liberal peace building. So liberal peace building is a model followed by international organizations is a model followed for peace building that involve international organizations and domestic actors, a sort of alliance between these two. And they want peace. That's the motive is peace or conflict management, liberal democracy, and market sovereignty through economic and political means. So that is the more limited definition of liberal peace building. So what the authors in this piece argue is that liberal peace building failed in Sri Lanka, and this was because of its failure to adapt to the local context, and how this was indicative of a wider flaw in the liberal peace building model. So in Sri Lanka, the local context would be, these authors focus on civil society organizations and how Sri Lankan civil society organizations play a very distinct role in Sri Lankan society, which is not universal. So Sri Lanka, at the time of peace building, had a very centralized political structure, as well as very strong grassroots civil society organizations that were built along religious lines, for example. So what the international organizations maybe perhaps failed to account for that, and instead would directly engage with the more cosmopolitan elite civil society organizations or NGOs of the capital city, who spoke English, and they were more familiar with international peace building criteria. Yes, so I thought this was interesting because it also goes well with another visualizing peace members' work on the flaws of peace building, of liberal peace building, and I thought this would be an interesting case study to add to the library. And then the fourth piece is by Sasanka Pereira, Remembering Death and Mourning the Loss of Innocence. So he looks at the politics of monuments, and his previous chapter was on war monuments that glorify death, heroism, through things like the pose, and how contrast with the topic of this chapter, which would be remembering loss of civilians, of innocence. And he compares two case studies. One is a monument that was funded by the state, and all the state fanfare that came with the inception of the monument. And the second would be a monument that was funded by civil society. And he compares the two case studies and how the role of monuments in peace, and whether monument building is sustainable, the attitudes towards monuments by the people around them. And I thought that was interesting, seeing how a physical thing can be representative of wider attitudes towards peace and violence after conflict during peacetime. And then the fifth text I wanted to talk about was a more recent text. It's by the International Crisis Group. It's a research report, and this particular section is titled "After the Attacks: An Anti-Muslim Backlash." So there was, I just want to contextualize this a little bit. So in 2019, there was attack now known as the Easter bombing attacks in Sri Lanka. So 22 years after the civil war. So this, yeah. So this was carried out by a Islamist terrorist, well, not Islamist jihadist militant group called NTJ, and it was later claimed by IS or ISIS. So after these attacks happened, there was an immediate big backlash against Muslims, with like community violence against Muslims, as well as governments, political figures, and their rhetoric against Muslims. There was also legal measures that were taken to disadvantage Muslims. For example, there was a clothing ban on face coverings, which obviously affected Muslim women wearing the burqa or the niqab, as well as dress restrictions on government, on what women could wear to government buildings, which precluded the type of saris, the typical sari, or the typical dress that Muslim and Tamil women would normally wear to the workplace. So I thought this would be interesting to include in the library, just to see 22 years after the war, after the country has taken an attitude of the war is over, it's behind us, how the nationalist rhetoric of Sinhala Buddhism still very much is very prevalent. I mean, that a lot of the language that the anti-Muslim attacks had was of this very similar language to the anti-Tamil violence. And this, I thought this, I would link this also to Vindhya Bhuthpitiya's piece, also in the library, on the perpetrator's piece, which questions who is post after the war is done and its state has deemed it peaceful, who is it actually peaceful for, and how fragile is this peace, and how easy is it to go back? Because yeah, so that's all. Thank you.